a session talking about the use of the annual data report generated for the Campaign to End Homelessness as it pertains to advocacy. So I'm Eric Hufnagel, the Executive Director of the Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness, and I'm joined by Lisa Chapman, who is the Director of Public Policy for the Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness. And again, so pleased to see you all here with us today. Would ask everybody to please pay attention to whether or not you are muted. We'd like to have you muted during the course of the presentation so we don't have any background disruptions. And then also, if we do have some questions, we can have you come off mute if need be. Would ask that if you can put your questions into the chat, we'll be monitoring that and try to address your questions throughout the presentation. But if there is a point where we do open it up for Q&A, we will allow you to come off mute and actually speak directly to us if that is needed. Okay, so the agenda for today, we want to talk about advocacy versus lobbying. We're going to talk about the data report and some of the themes and goals, etc., successes and challenges from the year, and housing and homelessness and racial disparities and the COVID impacts that we all experienced and are trying to forget about, but then also identifying some resources and materials to help you with respect to advocacy work that you may want to do. So next slide. Thank you. You got ahead of me before I even asked for it. You're awesome, as always. So I wanted to start out just by simply talking about the difference between advocacy and lobbying. Quite often that's a pain point for folks when they think in terms of being a nonprofit organization and have some confusion as to what advocacy is versus lobbying. And many people think it's the same thing, but let's just talk about that real quickly. When we think about advocacy, what we're talking about is really trying to advocate for or educate about a particular cause or policy. It's not specific pieces of legislation. We're talking about concepts in general and things that you are supporting, like additional funding for, or working to change legislation that would help this population or that population, policies to end homelessness as an example. So it's information and education. We talk about lobbying, that's more specific. That is actually looking at a specific piece of legislation and trying to influence that specific piece of legislation. So if you're contacting them and you're asking them to vote on House Bill 2465, for example, that's very specific. That's lobbying. That's talking very specific about how you want that elected official to take action, okay? So the difference would be with respect to advocacy, if you contacted that same legislator and you talked about issues that relate to that House bill, but you don't talk about that House bill, and tell them that you would like them to vote for or against a particular House bill. It's talking about the issues and informing and educating without actually the ask regarding action on a particular piece of legislation that will become before them for a vote. Next slide. So what is the purpose of advocacy? I think that's a helpful thing for us to be thinking about. Its basic level, advocacy is building relationships. So it's about interfacing with people to inform them about the issues that you're interested in. You want to educate policymakers. So it's building a relationship with them so that you can communicate with them. And when we talk about policymakers, we're talking about elected officials as well as non-elected officials. There are many people at the state level and at the local level who can impact policy in those units of government that aren't necessarily elected. So we think about educating them about important issues that affect the people that we serve. Then we also want to think in terms of advocating for regulatory issues. So if we're talking about engaging with HUD, for example, or MISTA, for example, or a governmental agency in your community, that's what we're talking about. And building relationships with people that influence your community. So it's not just elected officials, it's not people working within government, it's educating those people who have connections, who have influence, who people know and respect, etc. that is also a very important part of advocacy, because you may not be doing all the work yourself in this area, but if you can work with people who have connections and have opportunities to engage some of those people, whether they're elected officials or non-elected officials in units of government, that serves its purpose as well. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to pass it on to Lisa. She's going to talk a little bit about what the rubber hits the road with respect to the Campaign to End Homelessness goals.
Thanks, Eric. And one thing we do want to emphasize is the data report is from 2021. So it's from over a year ago. And these were the campaign goals, Campaign to End Homelessness goals back then. And I just wanted to say that it's super important to emphasize to whoever you're talking about, whoever you're advocating with, whether it be local media, could be your networks, municipal leaders, funders, that each local COC is part of a larger network of homeless response at the regional and state level. So we all have the same goals. We're working in concert together using the same data system and assessment tools, and we're collaborating across the state to improve our systems and share information and best practices and lessons learned both from Michigan and nationally. So the Campaign to End Homelessness goals, and of course we have a new action plan for 2023, but the goals here are also in alignment with the federal plan to end homelessness. And so you want to really emphasize with whoever you're advocating with, that this is a collaborative effort, and we're all working toward the same goals. So in terms of overall themes from the 2021 data report, the overall message from the report is that 2021 had mixed successes and challenges. If you remember back, seems like a long time ago, we were still really grappling with COVID and the impacts. And so we did see a small decrease of 2% in homelessness from 2020. And so you want to think about what was behind that decrease, and did that hold true for what you were seeing in your local community? We also saw continued racial inequities as well as high demand for services that we were seeing in the data. So is that consistent with what your data was showing? And can you talk about that? Those are great things to highlight in terms of advocacy, or just sharing what's going on, what your local landscape is. If you were writing a story of your experience in 2021 in your community, in your organization, would these be the themes? Strong housing needs, small decrease in numbers, high demand for services. What is your data telling you? And would your headlines differ at all? And really, how would you tell your story over the year? What stood out to you? I'm assuming that there's still a strong need for housing, affordable housing, and the ability for unhoused persons to be able to access housing. The same really can be said that's true now. So these are things that you can highlight in your advocacy. What did the funding enable you to do? You got, I'm assuming everybody, got some of that pandemic funding, the SARA funding. What did that do for you as a community, and what could you use more of? So in terms of behind the decrease in numbers, these are some of the things that the data report points to in terms of, some of the reasons potentially. So why did the incidence of homelessness go down in 2021? Well, of course, one big reason was the SARA funding, the emergency rental assistance that went out across the state and community. They were big factors, along with some of the other funding that really helped keep people in housing, along with the utility assistance that it supplied. Remember, there was various eviction moratoriums that were in place at the federal, state, and some local levels until fall of 2021. So what did you see at the local level when those moratoriums expired? We also saw an increased demand for both moteling and community sheltering, all kinds of interim housing assistance and options. There were capacity issues within organizations, and the social safety net was strained in many communities across the state. Did you also see an increase in the number of unhoused seniors? That was one thing the data report highlighted, a 2% increase, as well as increase in first-time homeless experiences. So were these some of the trends that you saw? And what did this mean for your organization in terms of changing how you operated, how you approached services, what your triage was? Did you struggle to find and keep staffing like a lot of organizations around the state and around the country, really? Did you do more virtual kinds of engagement and outreach with folks? These were all salient points that you can share with funders and legislators when you're talking about, you know, what you were seeing as opposed to what was reflected here statewide and what you were seeing in your community, things that had an impact on your agency and community. And I want to say advocacy for change is some of the highest and best work that we can do. Margaret Mead said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. It is the only thing that ever has." One of my favorite quotes, and really some important work that we need to do. So in terms of this slide, housing and homelessness, on the left side, you can see some of the housing issues, overall increase in housing requests, an increase in people seeking information on referrals for rental options. There was an increase in two regions in the regions 2 and 3 in the northern lower peninsula in Michigan, where homelessness increased, which was different than the statewide average trend. So what could, if you were in those two areas, what could you point to for reasons that, you know, were different from what we saw statewide? To me, the other really impactful statistic here is that on the lower right-hand side, the average length of time for homeless episodes increased from 59 to 69 days statewide. In terms of advocacy, what can you highlight about your local area that's similar to this or different? Did you see higher rates of unsheltered folks? I'm sure housing is increasingly difficult to find. Were you seeing lower vacancies and higher rents, or was that something more in 2022? Are you in a resort area where vacation rentals and summer workers diminish some of the affordable housing stock? These are all things that you could highlight. And you could put together maybe a one-pager with your local data that could be a companion to this data report, and you could use it for advocacy. Even if you don't have statistics for all of these data points, you could also, you know, use anecdotal information and tell some of the stories, such as the family of 9 that took months to find a unit large enough for them, or the number of vouchers that you've had to have requesting extensions, or were turned back because you couldn't find a landlord willing to take a housing choice voucher. These are all important things, as well as including people with lived experience in your advocacy as well, telling their stories.
Lisa, can you pop back to that slide real quickly? I just want to make a point to everybody. Thank you. We're talking about the 2021 data report. I know Lisa alluded to this earlier, but it's not an easy thing to put together a report on data from a preceding year. It takes some time. There's data cleanup, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, come January 1, you can't push the easy button and end up having a report. So historically, we've seen Michigan's annual data report come out really like in the third quarter of the year. And so it always seems to be late or later than you would like to have it. But I think it's important to think in terms of this is data that you can point to, even if it's not fresh, even if it's not from today, it's still showing what the trends were in our recent past. But we also know that when we look at what's happening today, quite often we look at that data from 2021, and those are trends that continue. So a lot of those things aren't just blips, if you will, and they do explain, I think, the context that things are happening over time that are consistent and not something that is only important in that particular year and talking about in 2021. So fast forward to this year, I think it's important as communities, sorry, I jumped ahead. You jumped ahead with the slide. My thought on this is You also need to know what's happening in your community now with the data that you have. Every continuum of care has access to their HMIS data. And that's important for a couple of reasons. Number one is that you can look at more recent information and you can relate it to what you're seeing here to see whether or not those trends have continued. But also keep in mind that the information in the data report is aggregate and statewide when we're looking at that, putting it into a statewide perspective. What's happening in your community may be different. And so looking at your own data and doing a crosswalk on it is helpful. But in your communities, when you look at your data, you can also contextualize the data that you have. And what I mean by that is there are certain things that may have caused or affected certain things to happen. And it's good for you as a community to be thinking about what that is. When you talk about a 30% increase in overall housing requests, it's just using an example of the first bullet here. If that's the data you're looking at in your community, collectively, you should be thinking about why is that? Are there any contributing factors that are worth noting? Is it because you had a plant go out of business and you had an increase in unemployment that took place, et cetera, et cetera. In a community, you can identify some things that may be contributing factors that help to frame the messaging that you need to develop about why certain data points exist that you want to talk about. So statewide data is great, but it's important to be aware of what the data is at that local level. For those of you who don't participate actively with your local continuum of care, I'm suggesting that that is a role for you and that the COC should be helping in identifying some of those data points that can be keyed in on and discussed so that you can collectively develop talking points so that you're not disjointed, if you will, when you're talking to elected officials. So agency A isn't saying one thing and agency B is saying another. Coordinating some of that messaging and working collectively to have the same messaging, I think, is important, and keying in on maybe a handful of points of information and not overwhelming the person that you're trying to advocate with, so that they don't feel like you've dumped 100 data points on them and they don't know how to sort through and understand what's the most important. That's your role in trying to define what that is and framing the messaging when you engage with people. There, sorry about that. Now we can move on. One of the things that we did see in the 2021 report, which is consistent with what we have seen as a trend over the years, is racial disparities that exist. And this should not be a surprise to anybody who is doing work in the field now. It's something that is an issue that's been raised for many years. Many of you are currently looking at that now and thinking in terms of your communities and racial disparities to identify those and think about strategies to address that. The annual data report reinforces that on a statewide basis. It's not exclusive to one pocket of the state or another. It is statewide. So when we look at that, Black and Hispanic populations have been especially hard by the pandemic as well, even more than the trends that we have seen before COVID. During COVID, we saw an even greater impact on persons of color. Black people are 3 to 4 times more likely to experience homelessness. Indigenous people are twice as likely to experience homelessness. The data shows us that. So we know those racial disparities exist. People of color who rent are far more likely to have issues finding and maintaining rental housing. We see that component as well. And Black heads of household are 4 times more likely to return to homelessness than white heads of household. Data tells us that. Again, we can see the racial disparities that are there. Certainly, COVID exacerbated those things, and we saw a much greater impact on people of color than we did whites experiencing homelessness. Next slide. So COVID impacts. I wanted to just touch on this because for some of us, we may say, well, COVID was in the past. So why are we talking about that? Within the context of this report from 2021, it was very important for us to think in terms of how COVID affected not only the incidence of homelessness, but also how we were providing services to address homelessness in our communities. But I wanted to touch on some things that really have kind of carried forward. But these are the things that we saw back in 2021. We were seeing sheltering and social distancing impacting the availability of shelters, fewer beds, people spacing more. Hotel use was increased substantially to accommodate some of the needs. There was a lack of housing vacancies, rental increases were beginning then. I want to point out that was in 2021. That's real today. We know that there's a lack of housing vacancies. We know that rental increases have been incredible over the last year, and not just in 2021. And eviction moratoriums were in place until fall of 21, and that was helpful. We know that, but we also know that that moratorium ended and that evictions followed, and so numbers have increased with respect to the number of people seeking housing. So when we talk about what happened in 2021, we can see that there still is a continuation of some of that in now 2023, and we need to refer back to those things. But it's important for us to think about how in our communities we have changed how we've operated. What are some of those things that we have done a little differently as a result of having to deal with the pandemic? And so one of those things is how are we interfacing with partners that we hadn't interfaced with before? Public health was much more active and engaged at the table, and I think most of you would acknowledge that. Some of you that are here today may be involved in public health, and so those are those opportunities that have been created. So we saw some growth that we had as a system as a result of COVID. So we'd like to think there are some silver linings there, but operating a little differently, thinking about how we can be more efficient, more effective, and bring more partners into the room is important. So we need to be thinking about that as we're communicating with elected officials and non-elected officials, so that they can also understand some of those things. What are those impacts that COVID had on how you operate? And make sure that they understand how, as a system, changes were made to adapt and to be more efficient and more effective considering those circumstances. So it's important to send that message as well. Next slide, which may be yours.
Yes, I had to unmute myself.
Okay, there we go. Thank you.
Yes. So one of the main themes in this report, in terms of my view, is housing, 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 and that really needs to be amplified. We've fallen way behind in Michigan. National Low Income Housing Coalition estimates a shortage of more than 200,000 rental units for extremely low income renters. That's just Michigan alone. And we are seeing the impacts now. We continue to see the impacts. We've fallen behind for decades, but it's really getting exacerbated more. So there's also more increased need for help with housing assistance, searches, and referrals were at the top of the list in 2021. There was also a 15% increase in people asking for a holistic approach to other support systems, such as including legal aid support, income support, nutrition assistance, as well as a range of assistance for getting into housing programs such as transitional or interim housing, rapid rehousing, and permanent supportive housing. So highlighting your advocacy, the local landscape with housing, with services, and the challenges that you had, especially where it's consistent with this data report or where it's different and where you faced unique local challenges. There are many opportunities to advocate for additional funding or laws or policies that would help people get into housing that are available to you at both the local level, within your city or county, but also at the state and federal level. And Eric's going to talk about that in a little bit. The more elected officials hear from us and hear from local partners and people with lived expertise about what needs to be changed and why, the better. So as I mentioned, there were some successes and challenges. It was really a mixed kind of year, certainly. So what were your successes and challenges at the local level? Did you have some of these that are similar. Sheltering and interim housing an issue. Maybe you didn't even have, maybe you don't have a shelter, or you only have a shelter for certain population. How are specific target populations, such as veterans, domestic violence survivors, youth, seniors, or persons with disabilities that have distinct needs, how are those populations faring, and what are the needs in your community? I'm sure you don't have enough of everything. So one example of an opportunity, a type of opportunity to advocate, just came out today. And it's MISHDA's Housing Choice Voucher Fiscal Year 2023-24, an annual PHA plan and administrative plan. That's a long title, but there's really two things. That they just announced an open comment period. So you can read the report. The Campaign to End Homelessness just sent out a message this morning. And you can make comments or suggestions for things that would benefit, changes that would benefit your community and the people that you serve. The open comment period is until February 24th. They're also having public hearings. So these are great ways of providing advocacy, as Eric mentioned, not to lawmakers, but to policymakers. And these policies affect the availability of vouchers and how the voucher program is handled and managed. And so this is really a way of, again, advocating for the people that you serve. One thing that you might want to do is to make sure you're staying on top of all the news and action alerts. You can sign up with your legislator to get newsletters from them, for funders and nonprofit partners by getting newsletters, from example, signing up with HUD for the SNAPS program, MISHDA, with your county. It's great to hear what your county is doing. Sometimes, you know, a lot of them have home ARP funding that they're utilizing for rental assistance, with CTEH and MICA as well. So these are all ways to stay on top of it. And if you have an opportunity to comment, or you see an open plan period, those are great ways to advocate. Eric, I think this is you.
Thank you. I'm sorry, my mind was just wandering, thinking about all those opportunities that we have, particularly at that local level, with respect to advocacy work that can be done. And so what I want to do is just talk about a few of the resources that are here, and then just remind people about the levels, the different levels where you can engage, which could be any or all, federal, state, and at the local level. So MICA has an advocacy toolkit. It's currently being updated, so I'm not sure what version is there, but that's an example of the information that is there for you to be trying to understand a little bit more about advocacy, and also understand the avenues that you can pursue with some additional templates, et cetera, to help facilitate your involvement that way. We also have been referring to the Campaign to End Homelessness annual data report from 2021. We will have a link for that available to you so that you can actually access it directly and take a look at it. And I would encourage you to do that if you haven't done that yet. There's a lot of very good information for you, and it's good for you just to get familiar with those data reports in general terms if you haven't seen one in the past. And then also the Campaign to End Homelessness action plan will provide a link to that, so you can actually see what is being elevated as priorities in the next 3 years, starting in 2023, with respect to goals, and also some of the strategies that are being implemented, where you can get engaged in some of those activities. It's a big tent. Everyone is invited to come inside and participate in that. So if you are able to take a look at that action plan and see where you as an individual have a particular interest, your agency or your community might want to get engaged, this would be helpful for you to have a better understanding of what's going on in the next 3 years as far as priority goals. The National Low Income Housing Coalition that we are affiliated with, we are a statewide partner with them. They do provide a lot of really great information, and we benefit from them tremendously. They have something that is a toolkit, a housed toolkit. Housed is a program. You notice the capital US there. So us, emphasizing that, housed toolkit. And there's a link that we will be making available to you as well, so that you can access that and see what some of those pieces of information are relating to the work that you can do with respect to educating and advocating. And then there's some additional tools specifically that NLIC has available on their website that we would also steer you to as well, as far as tools and resources. Beyond that, there will be some other information we're going to be sharing here that Lisa is going to go over, which I think are very important vehicles for engagement from an advocacy standpoint. But I did want to touch on the fact, as I alluded to earlier, that there are different levels of engagement in a couple of different ways. One is the federal, state, and local level. At the federal level, we do engage with members of Congress, and as an organization, we do have information that we will share so that folks can know what's going on at that level. Of course, we have that engagement at the state level as well, and similarly try to share information about what is going on. But I wanted to touch on the local advocacy work, because it's really important for you to think about that aspect as well. As a statewide organization, we have some limitations as far as our capacity to be able to get engaged at that local level, not because we don't think it's important, but it's because we don't have necessarily the capacity, nor do we necessarily have as much insight and understanding of what's going on at that local in each community around the state. So it's important for folks at the local level to be thinking about how they can get engaged at the local level. And sometimes that is just not on the radar, that you don't realize that you can be impactful by engaging at the local level. Lisa had referenced a couple of ideas, and I'm thinking even in terms of like a CDBG funding. If you're an entitlement community, those dollars go from the feds down to that community, and those communities be a designated unit of government that would make decisions about how those dollars get spent in a community. You should be engaged and try to have a voice in how those are utilized so that they meet the needs of the population that you're working with. The ARPA funding that Lisa referenced as well, a lot of dollars, as we all know, came from the federal government with the Recovery Act. And so communicating with elected officials and with non-elected officials who are policymakers can affect how those dollars get utilized. You can work with local units of government on things such as zoning, etc. What are some things that would help facilitate the addition of new housing, of affordable housing? How can you help to make that a priority so that units of government might think in terms of using their tax incentives to try to bring developers in and or facilitate the development of affordable housing? Again, there are lots of ways that you can get involved in advocacy, and referring to the data helps to provide evidence of the necessity of those local officials taking action. So I really encourage you to be thinking about the lay of the land within your community and how you can get engaged. But again, having the data allows you to open up those conversations at times and to reinforce the value of having dialogue and trying to educate and motivate, because I say the best public policy is informed public policy. So if decisions are made that don't include your voice or don't include the information that you could be sending to help shape the conversation, the product of that public policy may not be good. It may not be what it needs to be. So you really need to be thinking about how you're sharing that information to make sure that those people that are in positions of power, whether elected or not elected, are taking that into consideration as they are moving forward with recommendations and decisions that they make along the way. So I'm going to get off my soap stand here, and I'm going to pass this back to Lisa.
Thank you. So I'd like to answer, excuse me, a question that was asked about the statistic, the 15% increase seen in people asking for a holistic approach. That was in the data report. I think it was a couple pages in when it talked about, I think there was a statistic about social services and, requests for a lot of different things, and that was in there. I don't know what page, I can't tell you what page it is right now, but that's where that was from. And I would also like to tell you a quick story that highlights, the point that Eric was making about local, the need for local folks to advocate. And so we've been working on a source of income protection legislation for a couple of years now. And we had a legislator that just introduced it this session, like last week. And so I was trying to get a meeting with him because we have a big coalition. We've been working on it. We want to work with the legislator that sponsored it. And I wasn't hearing back from him, and I wasn't hearing back from his legislative director. And so I reached out to someone who was a constituent, and in one day they got a meeting with him. And they'll include me in the meeting, but it just tells you how important it is to legislators and policymakers, that you're a constituent. They work for you and they were elected by you. And so it's super important to weigh in with them and, have a relationship with them and provide information to them to help them make the best decisions when they're voting on a bill or putting a policy together. So here's some ways that you can advocate either with us or alongside us. There's a lot of different things that you can do. So I mentioned we're working on source of income protections. We have a statewide coalition for expanding housing access that meets every other Thursday at 10 o'clock. Micah facilitates this group, and you can email me. My email's at the bottom of this slide if you're interested in joining this group. There's lots of different roles for people to play. We have a research subcommittee, a legislative subcommittee that's trying to reach out to all the different committee members, and of course our legislators to try and have them move this to committee. So it's a really great way of working specifically on a source of income, tenant protection, that will really open up more affordable housing to people that get vouchers for veterans, people with SSI, all different kinds of legal sources of income that right now landlords can say they don't consider or accept. As well, we also hold, Micah holds a legislative action committee meeting every month, the first Monday at noon. We'd love for you to join us. If you sign up for our newsletter and for kind of our announcements, you'll get that link, or you can email me and I can add you to our list. It's a way we have guest speakers. We talk about what's going on federally and statewide, and we also try to highlight things that are going on locally so you can hear about great things that are happening or issues that are happening around the state. We are also holding an annual advocacy day. This is our 7th annual homelessness advocacy on March 15th. This is going to be in person at the Capitol. We are being hosted graciously by our pals at the Michigan Municipal League at their office at 208 North Capitol, which is basically kitty corner across the street from the Capitol. So we'll be gathering there. We have a great speaker in the Honorable Senator Sam Singh, who will talk to us, and he's been on both sides of the desk. He's been a nonprofit director, he's been a legislator, he's been in the House, and now he's in the Senate. And so he has a great perspective on advocacy that he'll be sharing with us. We also participate in some Capitol Hill Day events, and so can you, with our partners at National Low Income Housing Coalition. They have a policy forum in March that also will include a Hill Day. We might be able to do some virtual visits as well as in-person visits. So we will reach out and make those opportunities available if they materialize. And also the National Alliance to End Homelessness has their annual conference in July. They do a Hill Day as well. And it's really very exciting to be part of a team to participate in those Hill Day events. There's a lot of opportunity to learn about what the policy priorities are. They give you talking points, as well as we do for our Advocacy Day. We're going to have a prep video or webinar that you can either watch in person or recorded that will really talk about some of the things that are really on the forefront right now that we're advocating for. So you'll be well prepared to educate your legislators that day.
Lisa?
Go ahead, Eric.
Before you jump into the next bullet,
yeah.
I did want to point out with respect to the Capitol Hill Day events that as an organization, we have been a lead partner in either scheduling and or prepping people and or conducting those visits. And we are very pleased that we've been able to get the word out to folks in the past, expressing our intent to have partners come to the table with us, that it isn't just our organization that does it, it's all of us collectively. And so we do put out queries to people to see if there are others who want to join us. If they happen to be in DC for in-person, that is tremendous. If we have virtual meetings, we would like to put invitations out to folks to participate in it as well. So we really are taking leads with both of those organizations when they do have Capitol Hill Day visits. So there are lots of opportunities that we put out. And if folks do participate in our Legislative Action Committee, they would be on a distribution list and hear about those things directly. So if you are interested in those kinds of opportunities as well, if you get on that distribution list for LAC, we would make sure that you know about those and are invited to those when they do happen.
Thanks, Eric. And we really do like local partners to join with us, because you can tell those local stories and talk about, how it impacts the people that you support directly that we can't from a state level. So it's great to team up. As well, National Low Income Housing Coalition has some stipends for people with lived experience. That is a lower cost way of participating in their forum. So I wanted to mention that. And I really want to emphasize that every day is Advocacy Day. So it doesn't have to have, an annual event for you to take the opportunity. So really the best way to be a good advocate is to make those relationships with your legislators. Even if, you know them, take the opportunity, invite them to you have a tour coming up, you have an annual event, if you have a groundbreaking, or you're going to hold a landlord roundtable or anything like that. I mean, invite them. They love to come to those things and hear what's going on in the community. And that's a really great opportunity. As well, a lot of legislators in Michigan host coffee hours and different things. So you can look on their website and see what the schedule is. You can sign up for their newsletter and be informed about what they have, what events they have too. And those are great opportunities in an informal way to just hear what they're working on and hear what their priorities are and have a chance to connect with them.
Lisa, another thing that we didn't touch on here is the fact that on every election cycle, every 2 years, we do conduct a candidate survey, which allows us to gather information for those individuals who are running for a statewide office, as well as House and Senate. And the intent there is for us to get a finger on the pulse with respect to their knowledge about issues relating to homelessness, as well as what their views are on it, ideas for solutions, etc., to really determine whether or not we need to do some extra work with individuals if they get elected, or also conversely to identify those champions that we might be able to work with in the upcoming sessions. And so that is something I think that is helpful. That information can help to inform how you at that local level engage with elected officials by understanding a little bit more about where they're coming from once you see results from those specific surveys. So that's something I think that helps to inform the relationship building and what the angle would be, or the tack that you would take with respect to how much information do you need to share to educate versus how much is talking about developing strategies and solutions, and what role they can play in being a part of that through the legislative process they engage in.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, and we have some of those on our website, the ones that for people that answered it last year. And some of it, there were a couple that said they had experienced homelessness either as a young adult. One was kind of, I think it was after college. One was in his younger family days with his parents. And so it's really interesting just to learn. I would also invite you, there's quite a few new legislators this year. I think there's 54 in the House alone. So also, this is the start of the term. It's a really busy time, but it's a great time to introduce yourself and your work and your organization as they're just, beginning their term. This is the new 2-year session, so it's a great time. So now this is a chance to hear from you. Want to hear if there's any examples that you have, any ways that you want to talk about that you've advocated in your local community, the state or nationally. Please share your experiences. And I can't see the chat. I guess I can open it up now.
I'm taking a look for you. You're covered.
Okay,
So is Eleanor.
all right. Well, I just put it up, so thank you.
We do have a Q&A. Is the MISTA open comment period related to the Campaign to End Homelessness report, or is that related to another document?
Yeah, so the MISTA open comment period was actually sent out by the Campaign to End Homelessness. That was who I got it from. So if you sign up for their, information and messages, you'll get it. But it's the let me say it again. It's the MISTA Public Housing Authority Plan and their administrative plan. So they have their voucher program is governed by their Public Housing Authority plan and their administrative plan. It's their 2023-24 annual plan. So if you just Google that, Mr. PHA plan 23, you should get it. I think, did anybody put a link in there?
Haven't seen it.
Okay.
And I didn't add anything.
You didn't get it? Okay. Well, we can follow up with it. But that's something that, is a great opportunity. Talks about their, how they, and MISTA is the largest, I think PHA in the country in respect to the number of vouchers. So
And they have picked up responsibility for at least one other local PHA over the years. So that's also added to the reach that they have.
Yeah.
And seeing a name pop up in a question makes me think about the fact that there are some people who may be in this session who've actually participated in some of the visits that we've been involved with at the state and federal level. If there's anybody that would like to speak to their experience, what it was like, what they learned, some of the things that surprised them, etc. It would love to have you come off of mute and share with us here. If there's anybody that feels so bold as to jump into that water. Such a shy group. I understand. That's okay. But I know there's at least one person that's participated in it because I can see the name.
I think there's also someone who we just shot put together an advocacy video. And I think there's somebody in the group here that participated with us. So we really appreciate that. So there's lots of ways to participate, and your voice is important, whether you're too shy to do it in person. Like, for example, the PHA plan is a great way of submitting written comments. You don't have to testify in front of a public body. You can just submit written comments. So there's lots of ways that you're accommodated via your comfort level. But as you start, getting your feet wet, it becomes easier. And I have to tell you, that's my experience. I was super nervous the first time I went and did advocacy at a federal, Hill Day conference. But it was super energizing to me and lots of fun and kind of a whirlwind. But it's you get a really great sense of satisfaction, and you get a peek into, how our government works and how the legislature works, and just really exciting to be able to be part of that and really advocate for, such needed changes. So there's so many ways for you to participate. So lastly, we just want to thank you for your participation today, all your effort throughout the year, all your work, and we look forward to advocating with you throughout the year. So thanks so much, everyone, and we will see you again soon.
Remember, every day is Advocacy Day.